This is part 2 of the public opinion lecture, so we're going to talk about what does the public know and how do leaders react to public opinion, and then some more specifics about the major ideologies in America. All right. How politically aware are individuals, and how does this impact involvement? Two political scientists made some observations. Walter Lippmann said the average American does not know for certain what is going on or who is doing it or where he is being carried. He lives in a world where he cannot see, does not understand, and is unable to direct. Joseph Schumpeter, who is a political scientist who studies democracy, says the typical citizen drops down to a lower level of mental performance as soon as he enters the political field. He argues and analyzes in a way he would readily recognize as infantile within the sphere of his real interests. He becomes a primitive again. And sometimes we can see this behavior even amongst the political elite in our country when we see them ranting and raving on television. And so what both of these political scientists are arguing is that on average Americans have little political awareness, and in fact this is not unlike many citizens around the world. Many of us go about our daily lives not needing to understand a lot about the political situation going on around us. And this is even more true when it comes to foreign policy, because we've been very protected by the waters on both sides of the country well into the 20th century, and it wasn't until really the war on terror that we see a much more international focus from many people who are worried and concerned about our involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. All right, and so one of the things that we want to do in the political science department is try to overcome what some observers have seen as lack of political awareness. Okay, so please don't take this as some sort of accusation that you're not politically aware. This is a generalization of citizenry in America as well as other countries. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this political awareness, and I'll give you one example. A foreign policy example. In 1986, a New York Times survey wanted to know people's opinions on the state of affairs in Central America. So just let me give you a little bit of background about that time period. During this time, the United States was supporting what are called the Contras, which was an anti-governmental rebel faction trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. Okay, so in Nicaragua, the U.S. supports the rebels. At the same time, the United States supported the El Salvadorian government with huge amounts of economic and military aid because the government was threatened by what we perceived as a communist revolutionary movement. So on one hand, we're wanting to overthrow the Nicaraguan government that was a socialist government, so the United States supported the rebels. In El Salvador, which was more of a right wing, but we considered a democracy, we were supporting it because we didn't want it to be overthrown by a more socialist communist revolutionary movement. So the Times wanted to ask the American people what they thought of U.S. aid to these two groups, but they realized that many Americans didn't know much about the situation, and therefore their answers to the questions wouldn't mean much. So they wanted to focus only on those individuals that knew something about this particular issue. So they did a survey, they did a poll, if you will, where they asked two questions. What side of the government, what side is the U.S. government supporting in Nicaragua, the government or the rebels? And what side is the U.S. government supporting in El Salvador, the government or the rebels? If a person got both questions right, the Times would assume that the respondent knew something about the situation and go on with the interview. If the respondent answered one or both of these questions incorrectly, then the interview was ended. Only 8% got both questions correct. So only 8% of the readership of the New York Times that were polled knew enough about what was going on in Nicaragua and El Salvador from the U.S. foreign policy perspective to answer this question. This was the news of a part of the 1980s. This was the Iran-Contra affair during Ronald Reagan's presidency. So this was in the news every day. This would be like asking people where are the United States involved in conflict around the world today and not knowing that it's Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, so the idea here is that the American public tends not to know about issues of foreign policy and a variety of other issues that Congress deals with on a daily basis. And it's not that the American people are stupid, they just don't have to have an interest in it, okay? They have daily lives where their well-being probably isn't dependent upon what's going on in Central America. And so for the majority of Americans, not knowing who they supported in Nicaragua and El Salvador doesn't change their daily lives very much, okay? But when the American public doesn't know enough about particular issues, how then should the leadership act? If the public doesn't understand issues and therefore public opinion isn't really an issue, how should the government respond? How should leaders respond? Should they act as a trustee, or should they act only based upon public opinion? Okay. So sometimes when the public opinion shows that there is no clear direction, leadership will just take more of a trustee role as opposed to being an agent. Okay. So the more political knowledge that we have, the more we can integrate new knowledge into our interpretations of events. So if you're already leaning one way politically, if you know more information, that might help cement or solidify your point of view. Or maybe you don't know enough about certain particular issues, and the more you learn, the more you're able to form a political opinion. And then you're able to understand what new data or what new information out there is important. And so you can leaf through the news and think, I'm not so interested in what's going on in this particular region of the world because it doesn't affect me. But if you're a particular businessman or woman and you have dealings in Central America, you might have needed to know about what was going on in Central America. So most Americans have limited political knowledge. That's why they tend to fall back on those agents of socialization, because what we learn early on are the political opinions that we tend to rely on later on in life. Okay, but the more political knowledge we have, the more political efficacy we have. So that's one of the terms that you'll need to know, political efficacy. Political efficacy is just the idea that an individual has some impact on government. So if you have more political knowledge and have more insight into governance, then you might think you have more political efficacy. If you don't have a lot of political knowledge, you might not feel that you have an impact on governance, and so you're going to have less political efficacy. Okay? It's not the same thing as apathy. Political apathy means people just don't care. Political efficacy means that you don't think that your opinion is going to make a difference. Okay? All right. So if we don't know a lot about the issues, then how do we end up voting, or how do we end up voicing an opinion? And this is usually because we tend to identify with a political party. Okay? So political party identification is a schema, or is a way for us to identify with others who we think have similar views. Okay? So despite the declining number of Americans who say they identify with one or the major parties, party identification still remains the strongest predictor of an individual's political behavior. So your party ID, if you identify yourself as a Democrat, then you're more likely to vote for a Democrat regardless of whether or not you know the issues. So it's a voting cue for you. Even if you have no particular knowledge about the issues at hand come November, if you identify with individuals that you know are Democratic or from the Democratic Party, you're more likely to vote as a Democrat. If you know nothing about political issues, but you tend to identify with conservative issues or conservative individuals, then you're more likely to vote for the Republican Party. So this is party identification. It's a psychological orientation or a long-term propensity or likelihood to think positively and vote regularly for a particular political party. Okay. We don't have to identify with one political party in the state of Texas in order to vote in the primary. We have an open primary, so whether or not you're a Democrat or Republican, you can go vote in the other primary. Okay, so a lot of Democrats, when we have the primary here in the state of Texas coming up, may not go vote in the Democratic primary because they know Obama is going to be the nominee. They may jump over into the Republican primary and vote for a Republican candidate that they either want to go up against Obama or someone they're trying to avoid in order to try and influence the Republican Party's nominee. Okay, but party ID is a strong indicator of who you're going to vote for. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ideology. This is the set of underlying orientations, ideas, and beliefs. All right, so here's our belief in equality and liberty as well as order. let's call this law and order. So if we are on this continuum here, what we tend to have are liberals tend to want more equality and liberty and are ready to forsake some order for that to happen. Conservatives want more order and liberty as opposed to, and are willing to sacrifice equality. Libertarians want liberty and they want the government to stay out of their business, both in terms of the economy as well as security. Populists want some order but also equality and are willing to give up some liberty for that. So these are the kind of four major groups we have in terms of ideologies in the United States. Democrats tend to form here. Republicans tend to form here. There are some socially conservative Democrats. There are some socially liberal Republicans. Libertarians, this is more of your Ron Paul group here, and then the populists are over here. Generally, populists tend to come from the Midwest, upper Midwest. Okay. So liberalism and conservatism are the two main political ideologies in the United States today. Okay. So let's just talk about a little bit of characteristics of liberalism in America when it comes to domestic politics. Okay. So liberals tend to think that government involvement in the economy is a good thing in order to protect workers. Okay. And so they're high on unions, for example. Liberals in America tend to want an expansion of social services, more welfare programs, things, the safety net to help individuals who are unemployed, the poor, that sort of thing. Okay. So they tend to advocate on behalf of the poor, minorities, women, consumers, the environment. So these are the different publics, and their opinions are going to matter to the liberal wing of or the liberals in America. Okay. They tend to be more concerned about the rights of the accused, so to make sure that individuals have a fair trial, that they're represented if they can't afford an attorney, that they're not being railroaded, if you will, into a conviction. And they have a strong sense of a separation of church and state. So they're more likely to sue in order to prevent things like prayer in school. And so this is where you had the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is a liberal organization, for example. Okay. When it comes to foreign affairs, liberals are more in favor of arms control, that is, decreasing the number of arms out there that countries can obtain. They want to stop the expansion of nuclear weapons. And they want to support foreign aid programs to poor nations. The idea that poor nations and poverty leads to a lot of problems in the international community, particularly terrorism and other types of conflict like civil war. And liberals tend to be opposed to using American troops abroad to influence the domestic politics of other countries. So they don't want to use the American troops to nation build, for example. And they would rather rely upon international organizations to deal with international issues. Okay, so that's how the liberals view. So between these two panels that I just showed you, if any of these are the ideas that you have, then you will probably find yourself more in the liberal side of the political spectrum in the United States. Okay, when it comes to conservatism, domestically, conservatives tend to be opposed to welfare redistribution, this idea that there's some sort of social and economic engineering going on where there's wealth redistribution and affirmative action. Conservatives tend to want to have less regulation on business. They are in favor of low taxation, more in favor of the traditional family unit and in favor of things like school prayer. Conservatives tend to make an argument for their concern for victims of crime rather than the perpetrators, so they're less likely to want to have more laws that are designed to protect the perpetrators of crime and more laws designed to protect the victims of crime. When it comes to foreign affairs, conservatives tend to have higher support for military power, want to increase the role of the military. They tend to distrust international organizations like the United Nations, for example, and don't want the United States to be excessively entangled with the international organization. Okay. This is out of one of the textbooks thought I'd show you. Nancy Pelosi is the former Speaker of the House when Democrats were in the majority. So again, she's in line with many of the Democratic platforms. So she supports abortion rights, the right of women to have an abortion, opposes prayer in public schools, is supportive of affirmative action and expanding health care, wants to bring an end to the war in Iraq, wants to increase funding, increase the minimum wage. Okay, so these are all very consistent platforms for Democrats. Okay, so she's a former Speaker of the House. Now she is the minority leader in the House, and she's from California. The current Speaker of the House is John Boehner. He's from Ohio, and he is a Republican, a conservative, and wants to reduce the size of the federal government, diminish regulation, wants more prayer in school, opposes certain types of rights for minorities like gay marriage, wants to make abortion illegal, wants harsher treatment of criminals, opposes affirmative action programs, wants tax cuts, and again, this is very much in line of the conservative platform. All right, if we see how ideology has been tracked since 1970s up into more recent years, in 1972, more Americans identified themselves as moderate, as either conservative or liberal, and we can see here that conservatism has been on the rise until recently, and then we start to see a decline. And then we have a very much increase in the amount of moderates, okay? And then we see the liberal response there. So we can start to see a decrease in conservatism and an increase in liberalism and moderates. All right, so what's going to affect where you place yourself on conservative, moderate, or liberal? Okay, again, we saw those different issues that I just talked about. So issues, those salient issues might be important to you, but there's certain other types of demographic information that might influence your ideology. And one is your social class. Statistics show that the gap between the classes is growing, that social mobility has stalled. It's not any longer that we're going to find that parents, or that children are going to be better off than their parents. Parents for the first time are starting to worry that their children aren't going to be better off than they are. So you can see upper class here going skiing, and then you see homeless. All right, so that's a very distinct difference between classes. This is the 99%, the 1% that we're seeing in those types of debates. Okay, income may tend to lead to your ideological point of view. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to vote for the Democrats. Richer people tend to vote for Republicans, and middle income split their votes depending upon their circumstances. Another variable is race and ethnicity, and you can just see the picture here. These are students at Augusta College, and this is the reaction to the OJ trial. It was televised on TV. And so your racial and ethnic background really are going to affect the attitudes a person is likely to develop. Okay, we see that again in the Trayvon Martin case that I spoke to you about before. So there's still a deep divide racially and ethnically in this country. Okay, there's social variables. Religion is going to play a part. Bob Jones University is a Christian college in South Carolina, and just about every Republican is going to make a stop there during the primary season. And so this is George Bush during the 2000 campaign speaking at Bob Jones University. And so what religion is being, how religious are individuals, and this is going to make a divide. So you have the social conservatives who tend to vote more for the Republican Party, okay? And so people's faith is going to make a difference in terms of where they stand ideologically. Gender, we talked about the gender gap. The gender gap is simply the difference between men and women's views on political issues, okay? And this is a very powerful divide, and we saw this in the news over this past weekend where one of the Democratic supporters talked about Mitt Romney's wife never working a day in her life, and she's a full-time mom, and so this is a big debate about whether or not women who stay home are quote-unquote working. And so this has led to a big brouhaha, if you will, in the political campaign. But you can start to see how men and women might differ in terms of how they vote. And so there's definitely a gender gap here, that women tend to be less conservative than men. This particular time period was a little bit different. We had a third-party vote, Perot, here that probably took a lot of votes away from the Bush campaign. Okay, but you can see that there has been, since 1980, a gender gap when it comes to voting. Okay, and here are some of the disagreements that men and women have on specific national security issues. And so this is from your textbook. That men are much more conservative, if you will, than women are on national security issues, ranging from torture to withdrawal to opposing sending more troops. And so you can see the difference. Usually it's 10 points or more between men and women when it comes to issues about national security. Okay, this is out of place. Okay. So basically, there are different frames of reference that people have when it comes to their political knowledge, and this is going to influence how they're going to view the world and what their political ideology and what party they identify with. And so there's different frames of reference. And so when you think about how do we turn our political thinking and our political knowledge into public opinion, there are some things that unify us in terms of our public opinion. So a unifying frame of reference, for example, would be political culture. That things that make us uniquely American might be a unifying way or unifying frame of reference. But there's much more divisive factors that lead to our differences of public opinion. Again, ideology is the one, okay, in terms of the fact that liberals favor activist government, conservative oppose activist role in government. Liberals seem to want to have government as an instrument for economic redistribution, whereas conservatives look to the government to uphold certain traditional social values. Okay, so your ideology might make a difference. Your group orientation is going to make a difference. What groups do you really belong to? Okay, are you a member of one of these groups I just showed you? Does your gender matter? Does your race matter? Does your ethnicity make a difference? Does your income, your class, your religion? All those different groups you belong to might help shape your opinion, but could be divisive in terms of the others who don't look or act or think like you. And then, of course, partisanship. Okay, people tend to be staunchly Republican, staunchly Democrat, or something in between. And sometimes that is going to be the deciding factor in the polling booth. They're going to go in, not really know a lot about the different candidates, but because they identify with a particular party, they're going to vote for that party. So in the end, the idea is, does public opinion matter? And there's lots of debates about whether or not presidents, for example, lead public opinion or follow public opinion. And I think there's probably a little bit of both. We have seen recently that public opinion, and again I'm going to use the Trayvon Martin case, has shown that it has spurred government involvement with the indictment of George Zimmerman, and probably rightly so. On the other hand, public opinion may not make a difference in a particular issue if the government's not interested in pursuing it. So we see a lot of issues where the public, with social media in particular, are making much more of an impact. So we see this in the gay and lesbian movement. We see this in race issues. We see this in foreign policy. We know a lot about what's going on in Syria, for example, mainly because of what we see on Twitter. So Twitter and Facebook has really changed the face of how public opinion is spread and how the government is responding to public opinion. So we'll talk more about the media in the third lecture, which is the next lecture for this particular week.